The desert stretched endlessly, a vast canvas of sun-baked earth and jagged rocks, where the wind whispered secrets only the brave or desperate could hear. Underneath the blazing sun, a lone figure moved with measured steps, his presence almost merging with the harsh landscape. His skin was weathered, marked by years of the unforgiving wilderness. His eyes held a quiet intensity that seemed to see more than what lay before him. He paused, listening not to the sound of the wind, but to the rhythm of life around him. He was an Apache warrior, strong yet weary, carrying a weight far heavier than the packs he bore. Every line on his face, every scar on his hands told a story of survival, of battles fought silently within and against the world. He approached a small settlement that hugged the edge of the desert, like a fragile promise of life. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and cooking fires. Children ran in the dusty streets, their laughter cutting sharply through the still air, unaware of the invisible threads that fate was weaving around them. The warrior's gaze lingered on one figure standing apart, a young woman whose presence seemed almost otherworldly against the mundane rhythm of village life. She was a virgin, untouched by the harsh realities of survival, yet her eyes carried a mix of curiosity and innocence that intrigued him. Her hair fell like a cascade of dark silk over her shoulders, and her posture, though modest, suggested a quiet resilience that had been forged in small, unnoticed ways. He approached her slowly, each step deliberate, as if the earth itself might protest his movement. His voice, when he spoke, was low and urgent, a sound that seemed both intimate and commanding. "I only have 1 month to live," he said, and the words fell heavy in the space between them. There was no exaggeration, no plea for pity, only the stark truth of a life running out. A ticking clock that could not be ignored. The young woman blinked, startled, unsure whether to step back or lean in. There was an immediacy to his statement that left no room for casual conversation. The desert had hardened him, yet in his eyes was a vulnerability that betrayed the depths of his desperation. He was not asking for sympathy, nor was he seeking companionship out of loneliness. He was asking for something far more profound, an acknowledgement of the fleeting nature of existence, a chance to experience life fully before it slipped away. He needed a witness, someone who could walk beside him, not just on the physical journey, but through the intangible wilderness of mortality, memory, and meaning. The young woman's mind raced. She had heard whispers of wandering warriors and tales of fleeting lives, but none had ever spoken directly to her like this. His plea stirred something inside her, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and an undeniable pull toward the unknown. She knew the desert could be cruel, that every step carried risk. Yet there was an allure in the unknown that she could not resist. To walk beside someone who faced the end with courage would change her life in ways she could not yet understand. Around them, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and the distant sound of a lone bird's call. Time felt both urgent and suspended, as if the universe itself had paused to witness the choice that hung in the air. Would she stay in the safety of her familiar world, or would she step into a journey that promised both wonder and danger, a journey that might define the rest of her life or end it? The Apache's eyes searched hers, looking past the surface, past the hesitation, into the very core of her being. He spoke again, quieter this time, almost a whisper meant more for himself than for her. "There is much to see, much to feel, before the sun sets on my life. But I cannot do it alone." His words carried a gravity that made the young woman's heart race. She could feel the weight of his truth pressing against her chest, demanding a response she was not yet ready to give. In that moment, the desert around them seemed alive, as if sensing the choice being made. Shadows stretched long across the sand, dancing like silent witnesses to the unfolding scene. Birds circled in the distance, their cries sharp reminders that life and death existed side by side in the same fragile world. She could hear the faint rustle of leaves in a nearby grove, the quiet pulse of life moving on without pause. And yet, in that stillness, everything felt impossibly urgent. The young woman took a cautious step closer, drawn by a force she could not name. Fear and fascination warred within her, yet the desire to understand, to witness, and to experience the intensity of life in its rawest form pulled her forward. She wanted to know what it was like to live with the knowledge of an ending, to see the world not as a place of endless tomorrows, but as a fleeting, precious moment that demanded attention. The Apache nodded slightly, as if sensing her internal struggle. He did not rush her, did not demand an answer, but the silent intensity of his presence made it clear that time was slipping through their fingers like grains of sand. He reached into a small pouch at his side and drew out a smooth stone worn by years of handling. He held it out to her, palm open. "This is the world as it is," he said, voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "It is fragile, it is fleeting, and it will not wait for us." She looked at the stone, its surface cool and unyielding, and felt the weight of his words press upon her. The desert had taught him patience, endurance, and resilience. But now he sought something different, a companion willing to share not just the journey of the body, but the journey of the soul. She could sense that this was more than a request for travel. It was a call to witness, to remember, to experience life in a way that was both terrifying and beautiful. Around them, the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. The village behind them faded into shadows, ordinary life carrying on as if unaware of the choice being made. But here in this moment suspended between day and night, everything felt heightened, charged with possibility and uncertainty. She could hear the distant howl of a coyote, sharp and lonely. A reminder that the world outside was wild, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. The young woman's hand hovered near the stone, hesitant, torn between the life she had always known and the journey that beckoned beyond the horizon. The Apache watched her, his eyes steady, unwavering, yet filled with a quiet plea that seemed to reach into the very core of her being. There was no pressure, no promise of safety or certainty, only the raw truth of a life approaching its end and the chance to experience what remained fully, without hesitation. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the faint, distant call of the desert. The young woman's heart pounded in her chest, her mind a whirlwind of questions, fears, and unspoken desires. Could she leave the comfort and familiarity of her world behind to walk with a man who had 1 month left to live? Could she bear witness to a life measured not in years but in moments? And yet something deep inside her whispered that this was a path she could not ignore, a story she could not refuse to be part of, as the first stars began to pierce the deepening twilight. The Apache spoke once more, his voice carrying both hope and resignation. "The road is long, the nights are cold, and the world is not kind. But if you walk with me, you will see what few ever do. You will feel what few ever feel." She looked into his eyes, searching for the truth behind the words, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability of a man who had faced life with courage, yet now faced death with the same unwavering spirit. Her hand finally closed around the stone, a silent acknowledgement of the journey that awaited them. But whether she would step forward or step back, the decision hung in the air, suspended like the desert itself between past and future, certainty and unknown. And in that fragile, suspended moment, the story began not with an ending, but with a choice, a spark of courage, and the quiet, unstoppable pull of a journey that neither of them could yet imagine. The desert watched, silent and eternal, as two lives poised on the edge of change, their paths about to intertwine in ways that would test their strength, their hearts, and their very understanding of what it meant to truly live. The young woman felt the stone warm in her hand, as if it carried the heat of the sun itself, a tangible reminder that life could be as fleeting as the touch of a moment. She glanced at the Apache, noticing details she hadn't seen before, the faint tremor in his fingers, the way his jaw tightened when he breathed, the shadow of something long buried in his eyes. It was clear that the desert had not only shaped him, but had also worn him down in ways that stories could never fully capture. Yet beneath the weariness, It was a quiet resilience that seemed almost impossible to ignore. She had always lived a life, sheltered from the harsh truths of the world. Her family's small homestead had been her universe, the village, her entire horizon. Days had passed in predictable rhythms, marked by chores, lessons, and the occasional celebration. While the wider world remained a distant, untouchable idea, and yet standing here, confronted with someone who faced the certainty of his own end, she felt the edges of her world crack. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also exhilarating. The thought that a life could carry such intensity in even its final days made her pulse quicken in ways she had never known. The Apache's voice broke the silence again, soft but insistent. There are places few have seen, and times even fewer remember. The world is older than we can imagine, and it carries truths that are both beautiful and cruel. He shifted the weight of the pack on his shoulder, the movement deliberate, almost ritualistic. Every motion seemed to carry a purpose, a hidden story she could not yet read. I have learned much in my travels, and yet I have not shared it with anyone. Until now? She tilted her head, curiosity outweighing the fear that still lingered in her chest. Why me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a challenge, nor was it doubt. It was the natural question that arose when confronted with the impossible. How could he, a man living on borrowed time, choose to confide in her of all people? He paused, staring into the horizon, as if searching for an answer that had always eluded him. Because you still have time, he said simply. Because you can still feel everything without the shadow of knowing the end. His eyes met hers again, and in that gaze she saw the weight of experiences she could not yet imagine. Pain, survival, loss, and moments of joy, so fleeting they could vanish if not held close. It was as if he carried the entire history of his people, his land, and his own life in that silent, searching look. She felt a shiver run down her spine. There was a depth to him that demanded attention, a pull toward stories untold and secrets buried beneath years of survival. She wondered what life had been like for him before the desert, before the loneliness, before the relentless passage of time marked every day like a stone in a pile too heavy to lift. And even as questions swirled in her mind, a strange certainty settled in her chest. She would follow him, wherever this path might lead. Even if fear curled like ice around her heart, the Apache began walking again, and she followed. The sand beneath their feet was rough and uneven, forcing her to focus on each step, grounding her in the moment. The sun had dipped lower, turning the sky into a painting of molten gold and fading pinks. Shadows stretched long, hiding shapes and movements she could not see. It was easy to feel small, insignificant, and yet part of something far larger than herself. Every footfall carried her deeper into unknown territory, both in the land and within her own mind. As they moved, the Apache began to speak, slowly weaving fragments of his past into the present journey. He told her about the lands he had crossed, the canyons and mesas that seemed alive under the sun, and the nights when stars lit the sky so brightly that it felt like the universe had descended just to watch him pass. He spoke of rivers that sang at dawn, winds that carried voices from the past, and of mountains that had witnessed centuries of struggle and survival. His words painted vivid pictures, but they also carried a subtle warning. Beauty in the world was inseparable from danger, and the two often walked hand in hand. She listened, captivated, yet a part of her remained cautious. Every story he told hinted at experiences both thrilling and harrowing. There were encounters with men and animals, moments of joy and acts of desperation, hints of battles fought long ago, and scars that were invisible, yet still painful. She sensed that these were not merely tales for entertainment, they were lessons, warnings, and glimpses into a life shaped by both courage and necessity. And as much as she wanted to ask questions, she felt that the answers would come only when the time was right. The night began to settle over the desert. The temperature dropped sharply. The young woman realized that the Apache had anticipated this as he pulled a small blanket from his pack and offered it to her. There was no ceremony in the gesture, no words to make it seem heroic, just practicality born of experience. Yet, the simple act carried a quiet intimacy that unsettled her more than any danger could. In that gesture, she saw a glimpse of the man beyond the warrior, the human beneath the armor of survival. As they settled near a small outcropping of rocks, the Apache carefully kindled a fire. Flames danced, casting flickering shadows across their faces. The crackle of burning wood was the only sound, the desert around them silent and vast. She stared into the fire, watching the sparks rise and disappear, thinking of the days ahead and the uncertainty of what she had agreed to embark upon. The future was wide open, uncharted, and full of dangers she could barely comprehend. And yet, there was a thrill in that uncertainty, a pull toward a life that promised more than safety and routine. He spoke again, this time of the Apache people, their traditions, and the way the land itself taught lessons to those willing to listen. He spoke of respect for nature, of the balance between life and death, and of the quiet strength needed to walk through the world with awareness. She realized that this journey was not only about seeing new places, but also about learning to perceive life in a way she had never before understood. It was about feeling the weight and fragility of existence, and perhaps finding courage in the face of it. A sound in the distance made her stiff and soft. It's deliberate, almost too rhythmic to be natural. She looked to him, and he met her gaze without alarm, as if he had expected it. The desert was alive in ways she had not yet grasped, and danger could emerge at any moment. She understood that their path would not be simple, that every step carried risk, and that this journey was as much about surviving the unknown as it was about discovering the world. Hours passed. The fire burned lower, leaving only glowing embers that painted their faces with a warm, shifting light. The Apache shared stories of people he had met, choices he had made, and moments he had regretted. But even in the darker tales, there was always a thread of hope, a recognition of the resilience of the human spirit. She felt herself drawn in not only by the stories, but by the way he lived with honesty and awareness, embracing both the beauty and cruelty of the world. Without flinching, the young woman realized that she was beginning to understand the depth of what it meant to walk with someone who knew their time was short. Every moment was heightened, every sensation sharpened, and every decision carried weight. She felt alive in a way she had never experienced. Yet a gnawing tension lingered in awareness that the road ahead would be dangerous, unpredictable, and that each step could bring joy or despair. As the embers glowed and the night deepened, she finally asked the question she had been holding inside, one that carried both fear and longing. Where exactly will we go? Her voice was barely audible over the whisper of the wind, but it seemed to hold the weight of everything she wanted to know. He smiled faintly, but it was a smile without full warmth, as if he carried knowledge he could not yet share. The places we will go are not on any map, he said. They exist where the earth and sky meet, where stories are kept hidden, where the world reveals itself only to those willing to see. His eyes flickered toward the horizon, where darkness stretched into unknown distance. And there are things out there you may not understand, things that test the heart and mind in ways you cannot yet imagine. She felt both excitement and unease coil in her stomach. The path ahead was a mystery, wrapped in shadows and promise, and the stakes had never felt higher. Yet despite the fear, she could not turn back. The pull of the journey, of seeing life in its rawest form alongside a man who faced its end with unwavering courage, was too strong to resist. And so, under the vast desert sky, with stars beginning to pierce the darkness, they settled for the night, two souls poised on the edge of a journey that would challenge everything they knew, test every belief, and bring them closer to truths the world rarely revealed. The night held its breath around them, silent and eternal, as if waiting for the first step of a journey that had already begun in the hearts of those brave enough to take it. This section expands the character's backstory, builds suspense, and deepens the mystery of the journey ahead, without resolving the tension, keeping it gripping for the next part. The desert morning arrived in muted tones, the sun climbing slowly, stretching shadows across the sand like silent fingers pointing toward the unknown. The young woman woke first, her body stiff from the cold night, her mind restless with questions. She glanced at the Apache, still asleep, his breathing steady, and felt a mixture of admiration and apprehension. He had faced countless dangers in his life, yet here he was, vulnerable in ways she could barely understand. She wondered how much of himself he carried openly and how much remained hidden. Locked behind the walls of experience and unspoken memories, they rose in silence. The fire reduced to smoldering embers and began walking before the day fully broke. The air was sharp, and the desert felt alive with quiet movements, scurrying animals, shifting sands, and the faint rustle of distant cliffs. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. And the young woman realized that danger was never far in a land as vast and unpredictable as this. Each step forward felt like a test of both courage and endurance. A reminder that their journey was not just a matter of distance, but also of survival. The Apache led her toward a narrow canyon, its walls steep and rough, where the light barely reached the ground. He moved with the confidence of someone who had walked these lands before. Yet there was an unspoken urgency in his stride, as if he knew time was slipping faster than the sands beneath their feet. She followed closely, her senses heightened. Noticing details she might have ignored in her previous life, the patterns of lichen on the rocks, the sharpness of the air, the subtle shifts in the wind that hinted at something unseen as they walked. The Apache began speaking again, not of stories or legends this time, but of the dangers that lay ahead. "There are people who do not welcome strangers," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Some travel for survival, some for power, and some simply for the thrill of taking what does not belong to them. You must understand this, for we will encounter those who see the world differently, and we cannot always reason with them." She listened carefully, trying to absorb his words without showing the fear that threatened to rise. There was a certain truth in his warnings that resonated deep within her. The world beyond her village was not gentle, and every step forward carried both possibility and risk. Yet she also sensed that the conflict he spoke of was not just with outsiders, it was also internal. She could see it in the way he paused at certain landmarks, the way his eyes lingered on a distant peak, as if confronting ghosts she could not yet see. Hours passed and the canyon narrowed, forcing them to move single file along jagged ledges and precarious paths. The young woman's hands grazed the rough rock, leaving faint streaks of dirt and blood as her nails scraped against stone. The Apache never looked back, but she could feel the weight of his presence behind her, a steady, grounding force that demanded attention, even in silence. It became clear that their journey was as much about confronting inner struggles as it was about traversing the harsh landscape. By midday, the sun was high, beating down with relentless intensity. They paused at a small alcove for water and shade. The young woman sitting with her back against the rock, trying to catch her breath. The Apache knelt beside a shallow pool, cupping water in his hands and offering it to her. She drank slowly, savoring the cool relief, and noticed for the first time the faint tremor in his hands, subtle yet persistent. It was a reminder of the time he had left, the countdown he carried silently with him, and the reality that every moment mattered more than any ordinary day could ever convey. As she looked at him, questions surfaced she could not ignore. "Have you always traveled alone?" she asked. It was more than curiosity. It was an attempt to understand the depth of his life, to see the loneliness that seemed woven into his every movement. He paused before answering, his eyes distant. "No," he said finally. "There were others once, companions, family, people I trusted with my life. But the world is not always kind, and time does not wait. I have learned to carry myself alone because it is safer, and yet, safer does not always mean better." There was a pain in his voice, subtle and restrained, but it was there. An echo of a past she could only imagine. The young woman sensed a story unfolding, fragments of a life marked by both beauty and tragedy. She wanted to know more, to understand the conflicts that had shaped him, yet she also felt the tension of unspoken rules. Some truths were shared only when the time was right. She realized that their journey would be as much about patience and observation as it was about movement through the land. As they pressed on, the landscape changed, shifting from rugged rock to sparse scrub and winding sand dunes. The air grew drier, the sun hotter, and the sense of isolation more pronounced. The young woman began to notice subtle signs that they were not entirely alone, footprints that did not belong to them, broken branches that hinted at passing animals or people, and distant echoes that could have been wind or something else. Each observation heightened her awareness and stirred the tension that had been quietly building since their first steps together. The Apache seemed to notice her growing unease, though he said nothing. Instead, he led them toward a ridge overlooking a vast, sun-scorched valley. From there, the young woman could see the expanse of the desert stretching endlessly, a world filled with beauty, danger, and secrets she had yet to uncover. She realized that this journey was larger than she had imagined it, was a test of endurance, of trust, and of courage. And though she had agreed to walk with him, the reality of the challenge was beginning to settle in, a weight she could not ignore as they descended into the valley. The Apache spoke of the people who lived scattered across the region, communities that had learned to survive by understanding the land and each other. Some were friendly, he said, others less so. And there were those who would see them as intruders, threats to be dealt with swiftly. She felt the tension coil tighter, the sense that danger could emerge at any moment. Every shadow seemed heavier, every rustle sharper, and the unknown became almost tangible. That night, they camped near a small cluster of rocks, the fire casting long shadows across the sand. The young woman found herself thinking not only about the physical challenges of their journey, but also about the emotional ones. She realized that part of the conflict was not just the external world, but the tension between who they were individually and who they were becoming together. She was learning to see through the lens of someone who understood time in a far more immediate way, and it was changing her subtly but profoundly. The Apache spoke again, this time of the land itself and how it had taught him lessons of survival, patience, and observation. He described how the desert could provide sustenance for those who knew where to look, and danger for those who did not. Every plant, every rock, every animal carried meaning. The young woman listened, absorbing not just the practical advice, but the underlying philosophy of seeing the world fully, with awareness and respect. In the middle of the night, they were awakened by the distant cry of an animal or, perhaps, a warning. The sound was faint but deliberate, cutting through the stillness like a knife. The young woman's heart raced as she glanced at the Apache. He was already moving, silent, alert, every sense tuned to the environment. She realized then that the desert held more than natural beauty. It held a tension that could erupt at any moment, and that their journey would be a constant dance between caution and courage. She followed his lead, trying to suppress fear and notice the subtle ways he communicated without words, the tilt of his head, the position of his body, the quiet gestures that guided her safely through the unknown. She understood that survival was not just about strength, but about awareness, intuition, and trust. And trust, she realized, was becoming the most delicate and crucial part of their journey. By dawn, they reached a narrow pass, the walls looming high, casting shadows that seemed almost alive. The young woman could feel the tension coiling tighter, a mix of anticipation and dread. She knew that beyond this pass lay both opportunity and danger, that every choice could have consequences they could not yet foresee. And in the quiet of that moment, she understood the stakes more clearly. This journey was not merely a passage through the desert, but a confrontation with mortality, trust, and the unpredictable forces of the world. The Apache paused, glancing at her with a question in his eyes that needed no words. She nodded, understanding that they were about to face something that would challenge them both in ways they had not yet imagined. The desert stretched before them, vast and unyielding, a landscape filled with beauty, peril, and secrets that would reveal themselves only to those brave enough to walk its paths. And as they stepped forward, the tension thickened, the conflict both external and internal pressing against them from every direction. The journey had only just begun, and the questions, dangers, and mysteries ahead promised to test every ounce of courage they possessed. The desert watched silently, eternal and unforgiving, as two souls ventured further into its depths, unaware of the full extent of the challenges that awaited them. This section deepens the main conflict by exploring external threats, survival challenges, and the internal struggles of both characters. It builds suspense while opening subplots like trust, mortality, and character transformation. Without resolving any major tension, the sun had just begun to edge toward the horizon, casting long, harsh shadows across the desert. When the young woman noticed at first a faint movement along the ridge above them. At first, she thought it was the trick of the light, a mirage conjured by exhaustion and the relentless heat, but the Apache stiffened beside her, every muscle suddenly alert. His eyes narrowed, scanning the distant rocks with a focus that made her heart tighten in anticipation. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, the usual whisper of wind replaced by a tense stillness that pressed down on them. "They're watching," he said quietly, his voice low but carrying the weight of warning. "We are not alone." Her pulse quickened. She had been learning to read the subtle cues of the desert, but this was different. The presence she felt was deliberate, calculated, and close enough to strike if they were careless. She looked toward the ridge and saw shadows moving against the dying light, figures that melted into the rock with unnatural ease. The Apache reached for a small dagger strapped to his side, and though he made no sudden movements, the intensity of his gaze made it clear he was ready for anything. The young woman felt fear curl in her stomach, but it was a strange, almost intoxicating fear, a mix of danger and exhilaration. She had followed him this far, seen the breadth and cruelty of the world beyond her village, and now the reality of it pressed upon her in a way she could not ignore. Every story he had told, every warning he had whispered, had led to this moment, and yet she could not step back. Not now. The Apache moved silently, leading her along a narrow ledge that skirted the canyon's edge. Each step was deliberate, careful, as if the desert itself were testing their resolve. He glanced at her once, eyes sharp but not unkind. "Stay close. Watch everything. Trust nothing that moves without sound," she followed, gripping the edge of the rock with white-knuckled determination. The shadows on the ridge seemed to shift with every movement, as if aware of their own scrutiny. She realized that the conflict they were facing was not merely survival against nature, but against unseen eyes, the unknown forces that inhabited these lands and saw them as trespassers. Her mind raced with possibilities: bandits, rival travelers, predators, but she sensed that whatever they were facing, it was tied to the desert itself, ancient and patient, and it had been waiting for them long before they arrived. The tension in the air grew with each step. The Apache spoke again, almost to himself, recounting stories of past encounters in similar circumstances where danger had arrived without warning, forcing swift decisions that could mean life or death. She listened intently, each word layering over her fear with both instruction and revelation. She began to understand the magnitude of the challenge, not just in navigating the land, but in predicting human behavior, in sensing intent through silence and movement, and in confronting the reality that the desert tested more than physical endurance. It tested the mind, the spirit, and the bond between those who traveled together as they neared a narrow pass. The young woman noticed more signs of recent activity: broken twigs, faint footprints in the sand, a discarded piece of cloth that flapped weakly in the wind. The Apache's eyes darted from one detail to the next, piecing together a puzzle she could barely comprehend. "They are close," he whispered, "and they know we are here." Her heart thudded violently. She realized that every choice they had made, every cautious step, had led them to this precise moment, and that the coming confrontation was inevitable. She thought of the months ahead, the fleeting life he carried, and the lessons he had tried to teach her about courage and awareness. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to retreat into the safety of the known. But a deeper part of her, the part that had chosen to walk with him in the first place, surged her forward. The pass opened into a small clearing, the sun casting a fading glow across the rocks. There was a stillness there, unnatural and heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The Apache crouched low, scanning the perimeter. "We are exposed," he said, voice tense, "and they are patient. Do not move unless I tell you. Not a single sound." The young woman pressed herself against the rock, her hands trembling slightly. Her thoughts raced, and she tried to imagine what they were up against. She could sense movement beyond the clearing, a shift in the shadows, a subtle disturbance in the air. Every instinct screamed caution. Every story he had told about survival echoed in her mind. And yet she could feel the pull of the unknown, the urge to confront what awaited. Then she saw a figure stepping into the clearing, silhouette sharp against the last rays of sunlight. Not one, but several, their movements deliberate and coordinated. The Apache's hand went to the hilt of his dagger, his body tensing like a coiled spring. He whispered a command, a soft, urgent murmur that she could barely catch. But its meaning was clear. Prepare, stay silent, and wait for the moment to act. The figures paused, almost sensing the presence of those hidden in the rocks. The young woman's breath caught in her throat. Her mind tried to rationalize what she saw, to categorize the threat. But the desert had taught her that some dangers were beyond easy understanding, that the unknown often carried more weight than the visible. She realized that the real conflict was not just survival, it was perception, awareness, and the ability to anticipate the unseen. Suddenly, a movement behind her caught her eye. She spun, heart racing, and saw a shadow detach itself from the canyon wall. The Apache reacted instantly, stepping between her and the danger, dagger drawn. The figure hesitated, then retreated slightly, and for a tense moment, everything froze: the desert, the sun, the wind. Even time itself seemed to pause. The young woman realized then that their journey had led to a turning point. Every lesson, every step, every whispered warning had built toward this confrontation. And yet she sensed that this was only the beginning. The desert held more secrets, more challenges, and more tests than she could imagine. And the figures in the clearing were just one piece of a far larger, more intricate puzzle. The Apache motioned for her to move closer, and she obeyed, feeling the weight of trust settle heavily in her chest. They crouched together behind a jagged rock, watching as the figures began to spread out, circling the clearing with a methodical patience that made her stomach churn. She could see their eyes glinting in the fading light, could sense the calculation behind every step, and understood that these were not ordinary travelers or wanderers. There was a purpose here, an intent. It carried a dangerous precision. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as they waited, the sun dipping fully below the horizon and the desert cooling around them. The young woman's mind raced with questions. Who were these people? What did they want? How much danger could they withstand? And yet, alongside the fear, there was a strange exhilaration, a sense that they were on the cusp of something monumental, something that could change everything about the way she saw the world. The desert and the Apache who had brought her here. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the faintest whisper of sound footsteps, perhaps o'er the brush of cloth against stone. The Apache tensed, muscles coiled, ready to spring into action. The young woman mirrored him, every nerve alert, every sense tuned to the slightest signal. She realized then that survival depended on more than courage or strength. It depended on perception, timing, and the ability to act decisively in moments that demanded instinct and resolve. A figure stepped closer to the rock where they hid, and the young woman could see the glint of metal, the flash of movement. Her heart raced violently, every instinct screaming that they were moments away from confrontation. The Apache's eyes locked onto the intruder, calculating, reading intentions she could not begin to decipher. The desert around them seemed impossibly vast, yet impossibly tight, trapping them in a tension that threatened to break with any misstep. She could feel the weight of the journey, pressing down the stories, the lessons, the days spent learning to read the land, all culminating in this suspended moment of peril. And as the figure paused, the clearing silent except for the wind and the faint crackle of distant rocks, she understood fully that this was the climax approaching. Every fear, every uncertainty, every moment of trust and courage would soon be tested to its absolute limit. The young woman gripped the edge of the rock, her knuckles white, and glanced at the Apache. His eyes met hers, steady, unwavering, carrying the unspoken question, "Are you ready?" She nodded slightly, heart hammering, knowing there would be no turning back. Whatever happened next, the desert would demand their attention, their courage, and their resolve. And in that moment, as shadows stretched and the unknown closed in around them, the tension became almost unbearable. The figures in the clearing were poised, deliberate, and dangerous. The desert held its breath. The wind whispered warnings. And to travelers, bound by trust, fear, and the weight of fleeting time, prepared to confront a conflict that would shape not only their journey, but the very essence of who they were. The night pressed down, heavy and silent, as the moment drew taut, waiting for the inevitable clash that would test everything they had learned, everything they had become, and everything they had yet to discover. The desert had never been forgiving, and it would not be now. This section ramps the suspense and tension toward the climax without resolving any conflicts. It intensifies both external and internal stakes, building anticipation for the confrontation and keeping the story gripping. The desert seemed to exhale as the tension finally broke. Shadows shifted, and figures that had appeared so threatening now stood still, uncertain, as if the land itself had judged them. The Apache moved with steady precision, his dagger flashing once, a signal rather than a strike, and the intruders froze. There was no violence beyond what was necessary, no unnecessary cruelty, just the quiet authority of a man who had faced more than the world could ask of anyone. The young woman stayed close, heart still racing, realizing that courage was not about the absence of fear, but the ability to act even when every instinct screamed to run. The intruders slowly retreated, disappearing back into the desert as silently as they had come, leaving only footprints and the faint echo of their passing. The Apache let his dagger fall to his side and exhaled deeply, his body finally relaxing. The young woman looked at him, astonishment and relief mingling in her gaze. That was... She started, but words failed her. There was no way to capture the weight of what had just happened, the intensity of the danger, or the lessons hidden in the stillness that followed. He shook his head slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. Danger is always a part of life, he said quietly. We cannot always avoid it, but we can respect it, learn from it, and move forward. That is the journey. His eyes met hers, steady, clear, and filled with something she had only begun to understand. The wisdom that comes from walking through the edges of life. Where fear and beauty meet, the young woman realized in that moment how much she had changed. The girl who had left her village cautious and sheltered now stood in the desert, alive to every sound, every shadow, every detail. She had learned to move with awareness, to trust not just the land but herself, and to see life in a way that was urgent and precious. The Apache had not simply guided her through the desert. He had guided her into a deeper understanding of existence itself. They continued walking, now in silence, each absorbed in thought. The sun began to set, casting long streaks of red and gold across the sand. The heat of the day faded, replaced by a cool wind that whispered through the canyon, carrying with it a sense of closure and renewal. The journey had not been easy, and danger still lingered in the edges of the desert. But the young woman felt a quiet strength settle within her. She was no longer merely following. She was walking beside someone who had shown her the raw intensity of life, and in doing so, had helped her discover her own courage. As they reached a high plateau, overlooking the valley below, the Apache stopped and pointed to the horizon. "See that?" he asked. "That is the world unchanged by our fears, waiting for those who are willing to walk through it with eyes open and hearts ready. There is beauty here, and there is danger, and both are necessary to understand the depth of life." She looked out over the vast expanse, the desert stretching endlessly, and felt a sense of awe that went beyond the landscape. The journey had been more than a test of endurance or survival. It had been a passage through understanding, confrontation with mortality, trust, and the hidden strengths within themselves. The lessons were subtle, wrapped in moments of fear, wonder, and shared silence, but they were profound. She understood, finally, that life was not measured in days or months alone, but in the awareness and courage with which one embraced each moment. The Apache turned to her, eyes softened, yet still carrying the urgency of someone who knew his time was limited. "I have walked many paths," he said, "but none as important as this one, because it is not only my journey, but yours as well. Life is fleeting, and yet it is full. We can choose to live each moment fully, to see what is there to see, to feel what is there to feel, or we can let it pass unnoticed. You have chosen to see." She felt a lump in her throat, a mixture of gratitude, understanding, and something heavier, an awareness of the fragility of time and the preciousness of choice. She realized that their journey together had given her more than survival. It had given her clarity, purpose, and a courage she could carry into every day that followed. Night fell fully. The stars emerged in the sky above, clear and brilliant. The young woman and the Apache sat together quietly, the fire long since reduced to glowing embers. There was no need for words. The silence carried the weight of shared experience, the understanding of what had been faced, and the knowledge that life, even when measured in weeks or days, could hold immeasurable depth. Finally, the Apache spoke again, his voice soft, reflective. "I do not know how many days I have left," he said, "but I know that this one, here, has been worth living. Because we faced the unknown, because we trusted, because we chose to walk together, even when the path was uncertain." His gaze met hers, unwavering. "That is the meaning. That is the journey." The young woman nodded, feeling a warmth that went beyond the desert heat. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me, for showing me." She hesitated, trying to put into words the weight of what she felt, the transformation that had occurred within her. "For showing me how to see life differently." He smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and satisfaction in his expression. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "The journey shows its lessons in its own time. You only need to be willing to see them." They remained together for a long while, watching the stars wheel overhead, each lost in reflection. The young woman thought of the dangers they had faced, the lessons they had learned, and the fragile, fleeting nature of existence. She realized that courage was not a momentary act, but a habit of the heart practiced in choices large and small, and that true understanding came from walking through fear without letting it define or paralyze you. As the night deepened, a sense of completion settled over them. The journey, with all its tension, danger, and lessons, had reached a moment of quiet clarity. The desert, vast and unchanging, seemed to acknowledge their passage. The wind whispering gently, the stars glowing with a steady light. It was as if the world itself had paused, recognizing the courage of those who had walked through its extremes and emerged with understanding. The young woman knew that the journey would not end with the desert. The lessons, courage, and awareness she had gained would stay with her, shaping her every step. And for the Apache, the time remaining, though finite, was filled with meaning. Every step, every shared moment, had been a testament to life lived fully, to understanding earned through experience, and to the rare but profound connection forged in the face of mortality. When the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, the young woman stood beside the Apache, both of them silhouetted against the awakening sky. She could feel the depth of what they had shared, the intensity of the journey, and the unspoken promise that life, even when fleeting, could hold extraordinary meaning if lived with courage and presence. They did not speak, but she understood fully. The journey had changed them both. The desert had tested them, the unknown had challenged them, and the world had revealed itself in ways neither had anticipated. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, there was a sense of peace, an understanding that even endings carried beauty, lessons, and the possibility of new beginnings. The Apache reached for her hand briefly, a gesture of connection, trust, and recognition. She squeezed it gently, knowing that their paths had intertwined in a way that would leave a permanent mark on both their lives. She felt gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, and for the courage it had demanded. And she understood that the desert, with all its harshness and majesty, had become a teacher, a witness, and a companion on a path that had begun with uncertainty and ended with clarity. They descended from the plateau together, moving through the desert that had once seemed so threatening but now felt like a world of wisdom and insight. Each step carried the echoes of their trials, the memory of tension and fear, and the profound understanding of the fleeting beauty of life. They were different from the people who had begun the journey. Wiser, braver, and forever changed by the shared experience. The young woman realized that this journey was a story she would carry with her forever. A story not of endings, but of courage, trust, and the willingness to face the unknown. And as the sun rose fully over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and warmth, she knew that life, however brief or uncertain, was always worth embracing with eyes open, heart ready, and a spirit willing to walk through fear to find meaning. The Apache looked at her, a faint smile on his face, and said quietly, "We have walked far, and we have seen much. Remember this, always. Life is precious, fleeting, and full of lessons for those willing to learn. Do not waste it." She nodded, tears brimming, not from sadness, but from understanding. She had learned the depth of courage, the weight of trust, and the beauty of embracing life fully, even in the face of endings. And as they moved forward together, the desert stretching endlessly around them, she felt the resonance of their journey settle in her heart, a memory, a lesson, and a truth she would carry forever. The sun climbed higher, and the desert seemed less threatening, less vast, yet more alive than ever. The journey had ended, but the impact remained a reminder that even when time is short, life can be extraordinary, and that courage, trust, and awareness can transform every fleeting moment into something unforgettable. Top of form, bottom of form.